Gun ownership in the United States. A shifting landscape marked by gender and political identity. Well, it's telling us something totally different.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's like what's under that 30% is like a whole different story.
So, like, it's not as simple as it looks.
Not even close. Like, imagine a calm lake, right? But underneath, there's all these currents swirling around, changing the whole game.
I see. So the numbers are kind of deceiving.
Totally. We're going to break down those crazy currents, but first, we got to set the scene a bit. I mean, can't talk about guns in the U.S. without the historical context.
Right, gonna have that background.
So hit us with it. What's the historical lowdown on guns in America?
Well, you have the Second Amendment. That's like the foundation, right? The right to bear arms.
Mm-hmm.
Super ingrained in the American identity.
Yeah, for sure. But there's got to be more to it than just that.
Oh, absolutely. Like, think about the Wild West, right? That image of the self-reliant, rugged individual, the frontiersman with his trusty rifle.
Yeah, and the whole hunting tradition, still huge in many parts of the country.
Huge, especially in rural areas. So you have all these threads all woven into the fabric of American gun culture, for centuries.
Right. And somewhere along the way, guns went from being just tools to, well, they became symbols.
Symbols, yeah.
Like, I mean, when did owning a gun become such a political statement?
Well, it's always been tied to identity in some way. Income, education, race, gender, they've always mattered. Yeah. But in recent decades, it's like that political identification has become even more important.
More than ever before.
Yeah, like it's one of the strongest indicators of whether someone owns a gun.
Okay, so we've got this whole historical backdrop, this steady 30%. But then the report throws us this curveball with those trends from 2007 to 2024. Like, remember that calm lake we talked about? Turns out those currents are getting pretty intense.
Oh, so it's not so calm under the surface after all.
Nope, not at all. Yeah.
Are you ready to dive in?
Yeah, let's do it.
Data on the screen, numbers come alive. Male, female flows where the patterns thrive. Visual charts, public colors unify. Gender decoded, bringing truth to light. Small drum fill. We break it down, real talk. Trends unveiling, facts from every block. Here's your insight, watch the data glide. Gender decoded, let the beats collide. We break it down, real talk. Trends unveiling, facts from every block. Here's your insight, watch the data glide. Gender decoded, let the beats collide.
Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into some fascinating stuff today, all about how gun ownership is changing in America.
Sounds intriguing.
It is. You sent over some articles that got me thinking, like, we're moving beyond just hunting and self-defense with guns, right?
Yeah, it seems like guns are becoming, I guess you could say, like a symbol tied to our politics, maybe.
Exactly. Like, gun ownership says something about who you are politically. Okay, so before we get into the details, set the scene for us. What's the overall picture of gun ownership in the U.S.?
Well, the interesting thing is the overall rate of gun ownership has been pretty steady.
Steady. For how long?
For a while now, around 30% for the last 2 decades or so.
Okay, so 30% of Americans own guns. That's a lot of people.
It is, but here's where it gets really interesting. That 30% is hiding some pretty big shifts within certain groups.
Oh, so like the total number might be stable, but who's making up that 30% is changing.
You got it.
Okay, I'm hooked.
What?
What's the biggest surprise you found in these articles? What's shifting the most?
Honestly, it's the Republican women. Their gun ownership numbers have jumped dramatically.
Dramatically. Give me numbers.
Okay, so from 2007 to 2012, about 19% of Republican women owned guns.
Okay, that's not insignificant, but also not a majority.
Right, but then look at 2019 to 2024, that number jumps to 33%.
Whoa, a 14-point jump. That's huge. So is this just about women wanting to feel safer, or is there something more going on here?
I think it's way more complicated than just personal safety. The articles talk about a growing sense of like empowerment among Republican women.
Empowerment, like taking control.
Yeah, exactly. Taking control, exercising their Second Amendment rights, but also I think it's tied to how they see the world, the political climate, you know.
Right, so it's like claiming a right, but also maybe making a statement about their values.
Exactly. And we can't ignore the media, especially in conservative circles, the way gun ownership is being portrayed.
You mean like it's become a symbol of something bigger?
Totally. It's not just self-reliance anymore. It's almost like resistance against something.
Against threats to their way of life, maybe? I see what you mean. Okay, so if the overall gun ownership rate is pretty steady and one group is buying more guns, does that mean another group is buying fewer guns?
You are so sharp. Yeah, while Republican women are going up, Democratic men are actually going down.
Down? By how much?
Well, their gun ownership rate was 36%, but now it's down to 29%.
Interesting. So if Republican women are embracing guns as part of their identity, are Democratic men moving away from it for similar reasons?
Could be. I mean, it's not just about party policies on gun control. I think it's deeper than that.
Deeper? Like what?
Well, there's this sense that owning a gun just doesn't fit with the values of a lot of Democrats anymore, especially with all the debates about gun violence going on.
So owning a gun no longer feels right for them.
Yeah, something like that. And then you have the independent men.
They saw a decline too, right?
Yep, from 44% to 39%.
So why are the independents changing?
It's probably even more complicated with them. You've got regional differences, different ideas about gun culture, individual safety concerns. It's a whole mix of things.
Okay, lots to unpack there. So it sounds like we're seeing these groups become more divided when it comes to guns. What about the gender gap?
Good point. It is shrinking, for sure.
Shrinking. But men are still more likely to own guns, right?
You're right, but not by as much as they used to be. One article mentioned a study that said the gender gap in gun ownership has narrowed by a third.
Wow, a third. That's big. So it sounds like the image of the typical American gun owner is changing.
Big time.
Yeah.
It's not that simple stereotype anymore. The rural white male gun owner.
So who is the new gun owner?
It's not so easy to define. It's about what you believe in, your politics, and how the world is changing around you. You know what I mean?
I think I do. It's becoming more about your identity than, say, where you live or what you do for a living. So is it just politics and identity driving this, or are other factors at play, like income, education, where someone lives, all that stuff?
Those things still matter. But their influence is changing, too. For example, higher income is becoming a bigger predictor of gun ownership now.
Really? I would thought it'd be the opposite.
Yeah, it's kind of surprising, but think about it. Guns are expensive, and so are things like hunting and going to the shooting range.
So higher income equals more access.
Makes sense, right?
Yeah, it does. What about where people live?
Well, rural folks still own guns at higher rates,
Sure.
probably because of hunting traditions and all that. But even that urban-rural divide is shrinking.
So the country folks own guns idea isn't as clear-cut as it used to be.
Exactly. And of course, we can't forget about political ideology. That's still a big factor.
Conservatives are still more likely to own guns than liberals, right?
Yeah. And like we were saying earlier, it ties into gun ownership being more about your political beliefs. It's like a statement about who you are and what you believe in.
So we've got this mix of political parties, ideology, income, and these changing ideas about who we are. It's like all the old assumptions about gun ownership are being shaken up. What about race, marital status, education? Do those still matter?
That's where things get really interesting. The research suggests those factors, race, marriage, education, they're not as important as they used to be.
No, I thought those are always big predictors of gun ownership.
Not anymore. The bigger forces are culture and politics.
So it's not about those traditional demographics anymore.
Nope. It's more about where you fall on the political spectrum, how much money you make, and how you see yourself in the world.
Wow, it really does seem like everything's shifting. It's less about the old categories and more about this, I don't know, like a cultural shift or something.
You got it. And that has huge implications for how we talk about guns in America.
Definitely. We need to dig into that more. We've covered a lot of ground, but we still have more to explore from these articles. In the next part of our deep dive, let's look at some hard numbers that really show how much things are changing.
Sounds good. The statistics are pretty eye-opening. When you see the data, it really flips the script on who we think of as the typical American gun owner. It's not just about practical stuff anymore, like needing a gun for your job or living out in the country. It's much more tied into, well, our politics and our feelings about the world,
It's like guns have become this deeply personal thing reflecting our beliefs and anxieties.
Yeah, exactly. And you mentioned some eye-opening stats earlier. Did any of the numbers in these articles really jump out at you?
Oh, yeah, there were a few that really made me stop and think. One study they mentioned in the articles actually created this statistical model, right, to analyze all these shifting trends in gun ownership. And what they found was men are still more likely to own guns than women, of course.
Right, but by how much?
Well, they said men are still about 3.1 times more likely to own guns than women.
That's still a pretty big gap, but is it bigger or smaller than it used to be?
It's actually smaller. Back in 2007 to 2012, men were 4.5 times more likely to own guns than women.
Wow, so that gap is shrinking.
Yeah, it is. But here's the thing that really blew my mind. The model showed that knowing someone's gender isn't as helpful in predicting if they own a gun anymore. What's becoming more important is knowing their political party.
Wait, so you're telling me that knowing someone's a Democrat or a Republican tells you more about whether they own a gun than whether they're a man or a woman?
That's exactly what the model suggests. Like, your political party is a better predictor of gun ownership than your gender. It really hits home how central guns have become to our political identities now, you know?
That's wild. So besides that party affiliation thing, what else did these models reveal?
Well, they backed up a lot of what we've already talked about. For instance, they found that higher income Americans are about 2.2 times more likely to own guns than lower income folks.
Right, which fits with the idea that guns and all the stuff that goes with them, ammo, range time, all that can be pretty pricey.
Yeah, it's not exactly a cheap hobby. And as expected, the model showed that people in rural areas are still more likely to own guns, about 2.1 times more likely than city dwellers.
Probably tied to those hunting traditions we were talking about, right? Like where guns are just part of the culture.
Makes sense to me. Okay, so those traditional associations are still there, but maybe not as strong as they used to be.
Seems like everything's in flux.
It does, doesn't it? So people are looking for new ways to belong, new ways to connect with each other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And for some people, guns have become that.
Really?
Yeah, it's like guns are creating a new kind of community. You've got gun clubs, shooting ranges, online forums.
Where people who love guns can hang out together.
Exactly. And in those spaces, guns aren't just about self-defense or hunting or whatever.
What are they about then?
They're about shared identity. They're a way to bond with people who get you, who share your values.
So it's like a whole culture built around guns.
Totally. And that culture can be really strong, especially for people who feel like, the rest of society doesn't understand them.
It's like guns have become a way to find your people in a world that feels really divided. I see what you mean.
And you can see how that ties back to politics too, right?
Yeah, it's
Right.
like as the two parties get further and further apart, people are doubling down on their political identities. And gun ownership is becoming a way to show where you stand.
You nailed it.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder what's going to happen next,
Yeah, where do we go from here? Are we just going to keep getting more divided? Is that the future of gun ownership in America? Just more polarization?
It's definitely a risk,
Yeah.
but I don't think it has to be that way. I really don't.
What else can we do?
I think the first step is remembering that we're all human, even if we disagree about guns.
So we need to, try to see things from the other side's perspective.
Yes. Try to understand why someone might feel like they need a gun.
Even if we don't agree with them.
Exactly. And I think we need to stop talking about guns in such a black and white way. It's not that simple.
It's way more nuanced than that.
Right. It's about our values, our fears, our experiences. We've got to start seeing each other as people, not just as enemies in some kind of culture war.
I love that. Less fighting, more understanding.
Exactly.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. You've helped me connect all these dots between the statistics, the cultural stuff, and the human side of gun ownership. I feel like I understand this whole issue so much better now.
Me too. Reading those articles really got me thinking. One thing that really stood out was just how much fear there is around guns.
Fear.
Yeah, it's not just about the guns themselves. It's like everyone's afraid of something, afraid of losing their rights, afraid of being attacked, afraid of the world falling apart.
And when we're afraid, it's easy to retreat to our own little corners of the world, to surround ourselves with people who think like us, and to see anyone who's different as a threat.
You said it. And when that happens, it's really hard to find common ground, to work together to solve problems.
So what's the answer then? What can we do to counter all this fear and division?
I think the answer is hope. We have to believe that we can find solutions together, even if we don't agree on everything. And we have to be willing to listen to each other, to try to understand each other's stories, and to remember that we're all in this together.
That's a beautiful message. So what's the one thing you want our listener to take away from this deep dive? What's the big takeaway?
I think the big takeaway is that we have a choice. We can choose to let fear divide us, or we can choose to come together and build something better. And understanding the forces that are shaping the world around us, including the way gun ownership is changing, is the first step towards making that choice.
Couldn't have said it better myself. You've given everyone a lot to think about, and I hope it sparks some really good conversations out there. Thanks for taking this deep dive with me.
Thanks for having me. I always learn something new from these conversations.
Me too. And thank you for listening. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into a fascinating topic.